The morning mist clung to the overgrown gardens of Ashford Manor like a shroud, wrapping around the iron gates that had long since rusted in their hinges. Emma Hartwell stood at the entrance, her worn canvas bag slung over her shoulder, feeling the familiar weight of uncertainty settle in her chest. She had been coming to this place for 3 weeks now, but the sight of the decaying Victorian mansion still made her pause. The estate sprawled across 15 acres on the outskirts of Middleburg, Virginia, a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Yet somehow, Theodore Ashford had managed to become invisible, a ghost in his own home. The locals spoke of him in hushed tones at the grocery store and the post office, calling him eccentric, reclusive, and, according to some of the older residents, cursed by the weight of old money and older mistakes. Emma pushed through the gate, its metallic groan echoing across the silent grounds. The gravel path crunched beneath her sneakers as she made her way toward the front entrance, past overgrown rose bushes that had once been meticulously maintained. Now they grew wild, their thorns catching on her jacket as she passed. The autumn air carried the scent of decay, fallen leaves composting in forgotten corners, wood slowly rotting beneath peeling paint. She had taken this job out of desperation. After her mother's medical bills had drained her savings and her previous employer had downsized, Emma found herself scanning online job boards at midnight, her laptop balanced on her knees in her tiny studio apartment. The listing had been sparse. Caregiver needed for elderly gentlemen. Light housekeeping, meal preparation, companionship, generous compensation, discretion required. Then the interview had been conducted by a lawyer from Richmond, a stern woman named Patricia Chen, who explained that Mr. Ashford preferred minimal contact with the outside world. She had looked Emma over with sharp eyes, asking pointed questions about her experience, her reliability, her ability to maintain confidentiality. Emma had answered honestly, perhaps too honestly, admitting she had no formal training but years of caring for her late mother. Something in her sincerity must have resonated because Patricia had called the next day to offer her the position. Now, as Emma climbed the steps to the wraparound porch, she noticed new details she had missed before. A child's wooden rocking horse, weathered and faded, sat abandoned in the corner. Photographs in cracked frames lined the windowsills, their subjects barely visible through the grime and water damage. She paused at one image, a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, standing beside a tall man in a formal suit. Both were smiling, the kind of genuine smiles that suggested simpler times. Emma knocked 3 times, the sound hollow and distant. She waited, counting silently to 30 as she had learned to do. Theodore moved slowly, his arthritis making every step a negotiation with pain. She heard the shuffle of feet, the soft grunt of effort, and then the door swung open. Theodore Ashford stood in the doorway, a tall man made small by the curve of his spine and the weight of his years. He was 87 years old, though some days he looked 100. His white hair, still thick, fell across his forehead in an unruly wave. His eyes, a startling blue despite their cloudiness, fixed on Emma with an intensity that always caught her off guard. "You're early," he said, his voice carrying the refined accent of someone who had spent his formative years being educated by expensive tutors. "I wasn't expecting you for another 20 minutes. "The traffic was lighter than usual," Emma replied, stepping inside when he moved aside. "I can wait if you're not ready." "No, no," Theodore waved his hand dismissively, closing the door behind her. "I've been awake since 5. Sleep becomes an elusive companion at my age." The interior of Ashford Manor was a study in contrasts. Grand architecture, soaring ceilings with ornate moulding, a sweeping staircase with a mahogany banister fought against decades of neglect. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that penetrated the heavy curtains. Furniture sat shrouded beneath white sheets like sleeping giants. The air smelled of old books, stale coffee, and the particular mustiness that comes from windows that are never opened. Emma followed Theodore down the hallway toward the kitchen, the only room in the house that showed signs of regular use. Her footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors, each sound a reminder of how empty this place had become. She noticed Theodore moved more stiffly today, his right hand gripping the wall for support. "How are you feeling this morning?" she asked, keeping her voice gentle. "Your hip seems to be bothering you more than usual." Theodore paused, glancing back at her with a mixture of irritation and appreciation. "You're observant. Most people don't notice such things." He continued walking, slower now. "It's the weather. Rain is coming. I can feel it in my bones. My body has become a more reliable forecaster than any meteorologist." The kitchen was large but outdated, with yellowing linoleum floors and appliances that belonged in a museum. Emma set her bag on the counter and began her morning routine, filling the kettle, setting out Theodore's medications, checking the refrigerator for items that needed to be used or discarded. She had learned quickly that Theodore appreciated efficiency and minimal fuss. "I thought we might make oatmeal this morning," she said, pulling out ingredients, "with cinnamon and those apples from the farmer's market. You barely touched your dinner last night." Theodore settled into his chair at the small breakfast table, the only piece of furniture in the house that seemed appropriately sized for human use. Everything else was too grand, too formal, designed for a family that no longer existed. "You worry too much about my eating habits," he said, but there was no real protest in his voice. "I've survived 87 years with an inconsistent appetite. And you'll survive to 88 if you eat properly," Emma countered, measuring out oats. She had learned that Theodore responded better to gentle ribbing than to obvious concern. As she cooked, Theodore watched her with an expression she couldn't quite read. It was something between curiosity and sadness, as if he were trying to memorize the mundane act of someone preparing breakfast in his kitchen. Emma had noticed he did this often, observed her as if she might disappear at any moment. "Tell me about your family," Theodore said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "You've been working here for weeks, and I know almost nothing about you beyond your extraordinary patience with a cantankerous old man." Emma stirred the oatmeal, considering her response. She had learned that Theodore asked questions not out of idle curiosity, but because he genuinely listened to the answers. "There's not much to tell. My mother passed away 2 years ago. She had early-onset Alzheimer's. I took care of her for the last 5 years of her life." "And your father?" Theodore prompted gently. "Never knew him," Emma said, keeping her tone neutral. "He left before I was born. My mom always said I didn't need him, and she was right. We did fine on our own." "Fine," Theodore repeated, as if testing the word. Such a small word to encompass so much. Emma plated the oatmeal, adding sliced apples and a drizzle of honey. She set it before Theodore, along with his morning medications arranged in a small cup. "What about your family?" she asked, surprised by her own boldness. "You have photographs all over the house, but you never mention anyone." Theodore stared down at his breakfast, his hands motionless on the table. For a moment, Emma worried she had overstepped, violated the unspoken boundaries that defined their relationship. But then he spoke, his voice so quiet she had to lean forward to hear. "I had a son," he said. "David. He died 23 years ago, car accident on Route 50. He was 41 years old." Emma felt her chest tighten. "I'm so sorry." "David had a wife, Margaret, and a son, Alexander," Theodore continued, still not looking up. "After David's death, Margaret remarried and moved to New York. She wanted a fresh start, away from the memories. I understood, in theory. But she took Alexander with her, and I—" He paused, his jaw working. "I let them go. I thought it would be easier for the boy, not having his grief-stricken grandfather around as a constant reminder of what he'd lost." "How old was Alexander?" Emma asked softly. 12, Theodore said, finally picking up his spoon. "Old enough to remember, young enough to adapt. Margaret sent photographs for a few years, then Christmas cards, then nothing. I received a notification from a law firm about 10 years ago informing me that Alexander had graduated from Columbia Law School. That was the last I heard. Emma sat down across from him, her own breakfast forgotten. Have you tried to contact him? Theodore took a bite of oatmeal, chewing slowly. Pride is a destructive force, my dear. I told myself that if Alexander wanted a relationship with me, he knew where to find me. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid that he blamed me for not fighting harder to keep him close. Afraid that I had become irrelevant to his life. It's never too late, Emma said, though the words felt inadequate. People can always reconcile if they want to. Perhaps, Theodore replied, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it. But some silences grow too long, too heavy. They become insurmountable. They ate in contemplative quiet. The only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Emma found herself thinking about her own absent father, wondering if he ever thought about her, if he ever regretted his choice to leave. She had spent years telling herself it didn't matter, that she was fine. But Theodore's story opened old wounds she thought had healed. After breakfast, Emma cleared the dishes and began the day's tasks. She had developed a routine that kept Theodore comfortable without making him feel helpless, tidying the rooms he used, doing laundry, preparing meals, managing his medications. But she also made sure to include him in decisions, asking his preferences, respecting his autonomy. Today, Theodore asked if she would help him in his library. It was a room she had only glimpsed through half-open doors, a cavernous space lined floor to ceiling with books. When he led her inside, Emma caught her breath. Thousands of volumes filled the shelves, leather-bound classics, weathered paperbacks, academic texts, first editions protected in clear sleeves. My father started this collection, Theodore explained, moving slowly along the shelves. He fancied himself a scholar, though he never held an academic position. I continued it out of habit more than passion, but David loved this room. He would spend hours here as a child, reading everything he could reach. Emma noticed a leather armchair positioned near the fireplace, its cushions worn to the shape of someone's body. A side table held a stack of books, some with bookmarks protruding from their pages. This was Theodore's space, his sanctuary. What would you like me to do? Emma asked. Organize, dust. I want you to read to me, Theodore said, settling into the armchair with a soft groan. My eyes tire too quickly these days, and I miss the pleasure of losing myself in a story. Emma felt a flutter of nervousness. I'm not sure I'm a very good reader aloud. You have a kind voice, Theodore said, his eyes already closing as he leaned back. That's all that matters. Choose anything you like from the shelves. Emma wandered the library, running her fingers along the spines of countless books. She passed sections on history, philosophy, poetry, fiction from multiple centuries and countries. Finally, she selected a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, a book her mother had read to her as a child. She pulled a stool close to Theodore's chair and began to read. Her voice was hesitant at first, self-conscious about her cadence and pronunciation. But as she continued, she found a rhythm, letting the words flow naturally. Theodore listened with his eyes closed, occasionally nodding or murmuring in agreement with a passage. They spent 2 hours that way, Emma reading while Theodore rested. When she finally closed the book, she realized he had fallen asleep, his breathing deep and even. She studied his face in repose, the lines carved by decades of living, the softness that replaced his usual guarded expression. In sleep, he looked peaceful, almost content. Emma gently placed a blanket over him and left the library, closing the door quietly behind her. She spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning the downstairs rooms, her mind returning again and again to Theodore's story about his grandson. She thought about the photographs scattered throughout the house, the preserved spaces that suggested a family that once lived here, laughed here, belonged here. As she worked, she began to notice details that told their own stories. A growth chart penciled on the inside of a closet door, marking a child's height from ages 3 to 10. A baseball glove, stiff with age, sitting on a shelf in the mudroom. A framed crayon drawing signed Alexander, age 6, hanging crookedly in the hallway. The house was a museum of memory, each artifact a reminder of what Theodore had lost. When Theodore woke from his nap, he found Emma in the kitchen preparing an early dinner. He seemed refreshed, moving with slightly more ease than he had that morning. They ate together at the small breakfast table, Emma asking questions about the books in his library, and Theodore answering with increasing animation. "You should borrow anything you'd like," he offered as Emma cleared their plates. "Books are meant to be read, not to gather dust as monuments to someone's vanity." "I might take you up on that," Emma said, pleased by the offer. "I haven't had much time for reading lately." "Then make time," Theodore said firmly. "Life is not merely about surviving from one day to the next. We must feed our minds as well as our bodies." As the afternoon faded into evening, Emma prepared to leave. She had learned that Theodore preferred his evenings alone, a time for his own thoughts and routines. She gathered her things, making sure his dinner was properly stored and his evening medications were laid out. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked from the doorway. Theodore nodded, standing to see her out. "Same time. And Emma?" She turned back. "Yes?" "Thank you," he said simply, "for reading to me today, for listening, for—" he gestured vaguely around the house, "for making this place feel less empty." Emma felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. "You're welcome, Mr. Ashford." "Theodore," he corrected gently. "Please, call me Theodore." She smiled. "Good night, Theodore." The drive back to her apartment took 20 minutes along winding country roads. Emma's mind wandered as she drove, processing everything she had learned today. Theodore's story had touched something deep within her, a recognition of shared pain and isolation. She understood what it meant to lose family, to build walls around your heart, to protect against further hurt. That night, as Emma lay in bed in her small studio, she found herself thinking about Alexander Ashford. She wondered what kind of man he had become, whether he ever thought about his grandfather, whether he knew how much Theodore still grieved for their lost connection. She wondered if there was a way to bridge the gap between them, to heal old wounds before it was too late. But those were thoughts for another day. For now, she let exhaustion pull her towards sleep, knowing that tomorrow she would return to Ashford Manor, would cook Theodore breakfast, would read to him in his library, would continue the quiet work of caring for someone who had almost forgotten what it meant to be cared for. The following week brought an unseasonable cold snap to Middleburg, transforming the grounds of Ashford Manor into a crystalline landscape. Emma arrived each morning to find frost clinging to the windows, the naked tree branches encased in ice that glittered in the pale sunlight. The beauty of it felt temporary and fragile, much like the routine she and Theodore had established. On Monday morning, Emma found Theodore already awake in his library, surrounded by leather-bound journals and yellowed documents spread across the reading table. He looked up as she entered, his expression a mixture of excitement and exhaustion. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, suggesting he had been awake for hours, possibly all night. "I couldn't sleep," he explained before she could ask. "I kept thinking about our conversation last week, about Alexander, about the family history I've allowed to gather dust like these books." He gestured at the papers surrounding him. "So I decided to confront it." Emma set down her bag and moved closer to the table, curiosity overcoming her usual professional boundaries. The documents appeared ancient, some written in elaborate script that was barely legible. She noticed seals in red wax, official-looking stamps, and what appeared to be family trees drawn in careful detail. "What are these?" she asked, picking up a document carefully. The paper felt brittle beneath her fingers, as if it might crumble at the slightest pressure. "The story of how an American businessman became a count," Theodore said with a wry smile. "It's rather ridiculous when you think about it, but it meant everything to my father, and it shaped our family in ways I'm still trying to understand." He explained that his grandfather, William Ashford, had made a fortune in textiles during the late 1800s. William's business ventures took him throughout Europe, where he became acquainted with various nobility facing financial ruin after World War I. In 1921, William purchased a failing estate in Austria from a count who had no heirs and desperately needed capital. Part of the transaction, conducted through complex legal maneuvering, included the transfer of the comital title to William's family line. It wasn't recognized by most governments, of course, Theodore continued, warming to the story. But it was legally documented, and my grandfather insisted we maintain the connection to that European heritage. He even sent my father to be educated in Vienna for several years. It became an obsession, this idea that we were more than just wealthy Americans, that we had noble blood, continental sophistication. Emma listened, fascinated by this glimpse into Theodore's past. Did your son, David, care about the title? Theodore's expression softened. David thought it was pretentious nonsense. He refused to use the title, told people it was an embarrassing family affectation. He wanted to be judged on his own merits, not on some purchased aristocratic fantasy. He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of a photograph. I respected that about him, even when it hurt my father deeply. And Alexander? Emma asked gently. Does he know about this? I assume Margaret told him something, Theodore said, but I doubt he cares any more than David did. The younger generation has no use for such outdated concepts. They spent the morning organizing the documents, Theodore narrating the history, while Emma carefully sorted papers into categories. She learned about the Austrian estate, long since sold, and the various business ventures that had sustained the Ashford fortune through generations. She discovered that Theodore's father had been a demanding, difficult man who measured success in titles and social standing rather than personal happiness. He never forgave me for marrying Elizabeth, Theodore said, holding a wedding photograph with hands that trembled slightly. She was the daughter of our gardener, you see. Beautiful, intelligent, kind, but not from the right social class. My father threatened to disinherit me, said I was disgracing the family name. But you married her anyway, Emma observed. I did, Theodore confirmed, a rare smile crossing his face. We had 43 wonderful years together before she passed. David was our only child, and he inherited his mother's warmth and common sense rather than my father's pretensions. Elizabeth always said that was the greatest success of our marriage, raising a son who valued people over pedigree. The conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the front door. Emma and Theodore exchanged surprised glances. Visitors were extremely rare at Ashford Manor. Theodore gestured for Emma to answer it, and she made her way through the quiet house to the entrance. A woman stood on the porch, middle-aged with sharp features and an expression of barely concealed curiosity. She wore an expensive coat and carried a designer handbag, her manicured nails drumming impatiently against its leather surface. Can I help you? Emma asked, keeping her voice polite but neutral. I'm looking for Theodore Ashford, the woman said, her eyes scanning past Emma to peer into the house. I'm Carol Hendricks from the Middleburg Historical Society. We've been trying to reach Mr. Ashford for months about the estate. Emma felt protective instincts flare. Mr. Ashford doesn't receive unexpected visitors. If you'd like to leave your contact information, I can pass it along to him. Carol's expression hardened. And you are? I work for Mr. Ashford, Emma replied, deliberately vague. He values his privacy. I'm sure he does, Carol said, her tone suggesting she thought otherwise. But the community has an interest in this property. We've heard rumors that it might be sold, and the Historical Society wants to ensure that any sale preserves the architectural integrity of the manor. It's one of the oldest estates in the county. I don't know anything about a sale, Emma said truthfully, but I'll let Mr. Ashford know you stopped by. Carol produced a business card, holding it out with barely disguised irritation. Please do, and tell him the time is of the essence. We've heard that family members may be contesting the property, and the Historical Society wants to make our position clear before any legal proceedings begin." Emma took the card, her mind racing. Family members, legal proceedings. Theodore had never mentioned anything like that. "I'll give him your message," she said, beginning to close the door. Carol stepped back reluctantly. "You know," she added, her voice taking on a confidential tone that felt calculated rather than genuine, "people in town are talking. A young woman spending so much time alone with an elderly, wealthy man. Some are wondering about your intentions." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, anger mixing with embarrassment. "My intentions are to do my job, which is caring for Mr. Ashford. What people choose to gossip about says more about them than it does about me." She closed the door firmly, leaning against it as her heart pounded. The interaction had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. She had been so focused on Theodore and their developing friendship that she hadn't considered how their relationship might appear to outsiders. When she returned to the library, Theodore took one look at her face and frowned. "What happened?" Emma handed him the business card and relayed the conversation, including Carol's insinuation about her motives. Theodore's expression darkened with each word. "Vultures," he muttered, tossing the card aside. "The Historical Society has been circling for years, hoping I'll donate the property or agree to some preservation easement that would give them control. As for the gossip," he met Emma's eyes directly, "I apologize that my decision to hire you has subjected you to such pettiness." "You don't need to apologize," Emma said, though she appreciated the gesture. But what did she mean about family members and legal proceedings? Theodore sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 87 years. "I suppose I should have told you sooner. About 3 months ago, I received a letter from a law firm in New York. Alexander's firm, actually, though the letter wasn't signed by him personally. It informed me that there were questions about the European title and the associated property rights that had never been fully resolved." Emma sat down, sensing this was more complicated than Theodore had initially suggested. "What kind of questions?" "Apparently, when my grandfather purchased the Austrian estate and title, there were provisions in the original documents about hereditary succession," Theodore explained. "The title was supposed to pass through the male line, but there were clauses about the property itself reverting to the original family if certain conditions weren't met. No one paid attention to this for decades because the Austrian estate was sold in the 1950s, and we all assumed the matter was closed.